Turn back. Now. The voice was soft, calm, female. Captain Daniel Mercer froze. Because there was no woman in the cockpit. The aircraft sat on the runway of Denver International Airport, engines humming steadily as Flight 728 prepared for departure. Inside the cockpit, only two people were present. Daniel and his first officer, Mark Alvarez. The cockpit door had been locked since pushback. The flight attendants were seated. Passengers were fastening their seatbelts. Everything was normal, except for the voice Daniel had just heard, clear as if someone had leaned over his shoulder. Do not leave yet. Daniel slowly turned his head. The cockpit behind him was empty. Mark glanced over. You okay, Captain? Daniel didn't answer immediately, because in that brief moment, something else happened. A faint scent filled the cockpit. Not fuel. Not electronics. Roses. Daniel Mercer had flown for 22 years. He believed in procedures, in checklists, in physics, not in voices, not in miracles. And yet, what happened in the next 15 minutes would save 184 lives. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Stories like this remind us that sometimes help arrives when we least expect it. Captain Daniel Mercer had spent most of his adult life inside cockpits. At 44 years old, he had logged more than 12,000 hours in the air. Long-haul flights, short domestic hops, winter storms over the Rockies, calm summer skies above the Pacific. If there was one thing Daniel believed in, it was systems. Airplanes, in his mind, were not miracles. They were equations. Lift, drag, thrust, weight. Every movement in the sky could be explained by numbers, procedures, and discipline. That mindset had made him one of the most respected pilots in his airline. Flight attendants liked flying with him because he never panicked. First officers trusted him because he followed every checklist with almost surgical precision. And passengers, though they never met him, benefited from the quiet certainty of a man who believed that nothing in aviation should ever rely on luck. Daniel rarely talked about his personal life, but those who worked with him long enough learned two things. First, he had grown up in a small town in New Mexico, where his father repaired farm equipment and his mother worked at the local parish office. Second, Daniel had left that small town as soon as he could, not because he disliked it, but because the world, to him, was bigger than dusty roads and church bells. Flying gave him something else: altitude, freedom, distance. He liked distance. Distance from routine. Distance from expectations. And, perhaps most of all, distance from the kind of faith his mother had always tried to place in his life. Because Daniel Mercer respected religion, but he didn't believe in it. Not the way she did. To Daniel, faith was something people leaned on when they lacked answers. And in aviation, answers mattered too much to leave to faith. That belief had guided every flight he had ever taken, every decision, every emergency, every landing. For more than 2 decades, it had never failed him. But on a quiet morning in Denver, Daniel Mercer was about to encounter something that no checklist had ever prepared him for. And the voice he would soon hear in that cockpit would challenge everything he believed about the sky. Daniel Mercer rarely spoke about his mother, not because he didn't love her, but because she represented a world he had quietly stepped away from. Maria Mercer had spent most of her life working at St. Gabriel Parish in a small town outside Albuquerque. She wasn't a nun, and she wasn't a theologian. She was simply the woman who answered phones, arranged flowers near the altar, and reminded people when the parish fundraiser was coming. But everyone in that town knew something about Maria. She prayed for everything, for neighbors who were sick, for farmers during drought, for children leaving home, and most of all, for her son who flew airplanes. Every time Daniel called home, the conversation followed a familiar pattern. "How was the flight?" she would ask. "Smooth," Daniel usually answered. Then she would say the same sentence she had said for more than 20 years. "I prayed for you today." Daniel would smile politely through the phone. "Thanks, Mom." But he never told her the truth. He didn't think her prayers had anything to do with the airplanes landing safely. Airplanes landed safely because of training, because of engineering, because of discipline, not because someone lit a candle in a quiet church hundreds of miles away. Still, Maria had a small ritual she refused to abandon. Years earlier, when Daniel finished flight school, she had given him something. A tiny image of the Virgin Mary. It wasn't expensive, just a small laminated picture, worn slightly around the edges. On the back she had written a few words in careful handwriting. May she watch over every mile you fly. Daniel had almost laughed when she gave it to him, but he saw the way she held it, gently, like something fragile and important. So instead of refusing it, he slipped it into the side pocket of his flight bag. He had carried that bag across thousands of flights since then, across deserts, across oceans, across storm clouds and clear skies. The picture stayed there, mostly forgotten, just another object in a bag filled with manuals and charts. But on the morning of Flight 728, for the first time in 22 years, that small picture was about to become impossible to ignore. Daniel Mercer built his career the way engineers build airplanes. Carefully, step by step, nothing rushed, nothing careless. After finishing flight school in Arizona, Daniel started where most commercial pilots begin, flying small regional routes, short flights, small aircraft, long days. The work wasn't glamorous, but Daniel didn't mind, because every flight was another lesson, another hour logged, another chance to sharpen the one skill he trusted more than anything else: discipline. In aviation, discipline saves lives. A forgotten checklist item can destroy an aircraft. A rushed decision can kill hundreds of people. Daniel understood that better than most. While other young pilots sometimes relied on instinct, Daniel relied on something else: procedure. Every switch, every gauge, every call-out, always in the correct order. That habit earned him a reputation among other pilots. Mercer flies like a machine, one training captain once joked. But it wasn't an insult. It was respect. Because machines don't panic. Machines don't improvise recklessly. Machines follow systems designed to keep people alive. Over the years, Daniel moved up. Regional flights became national routes. The small turboprops became larger jetliners. And eventually, Daniel Mercer became a captain. The left seat, the final authority on every flight. By the time he reached his 40s, Daniel had handled nearly every situation a pilot could face: severe turbulence, engine warnings, medical emergencies, even one emergency landing during a blizzard years earlier in Chicago. In every situation, he relied on the same thing: calm, checklists, logic, never superstition, never instinct alone, and certainly never anything that sounded like a miracle. In fact, Daniel often said something during training sessions with younger pilots, a phrase they would repeat years later: airplanes don't stay in the sky because someone prayed. He would tap the instrument panel when he said it. They stay in the sky because this cockpit is built on physics and discipline. For 22 years of flying, that belief had never been challenged. Not once. But on a clear morning at Denver International Airport, Daniel Mercer was about to experience something that physics could not explain. The morning of Flight 728 began like hundreds of other mornings Daniel Mercer had experienced in his career. Routine, predictable, safe. Denver International Airport was already alive with movement when Daniel arrived at the terminal just after sunrise. The wide glass windows of the concourse glowed with pale morning light, and aircraft rolled slowly across the vast network of taxiways outside. Inside the crew briefing room, the atmosphere was calm. Daniel scanned the flight plan displayed on the tablet in front of him. Flight 728, Denver to Seattle. Flight time, 2 hours and 30 minutes. Weather along the route looked clear. A mild jet stream advantage. Smooth ride expected. His first officer that day was Mark Alvarez, a pilot in his early 30s with nearly 6,000 flight hours. Mark had flown with Daniel several times before and appreciated the captain's calm, methodical style. "You picked a good day to fly," Mark said as he reviewed the weather charts. Daniel nodded. "Looks quiet all the way to Seattle." No storms. No turbulence warnings. No technical alerts from maintenance. In aviation terms, it was the kind of day pilots quietly hoped for. Boring. The aircraft assigned to them was a Boeing 737, already parked at Gate C-32. Ground crews moved around it with practiced efficiency, fuel trucks, baggage loaders, catering carts. Passengers would begin boarding soon. 184 people would be on board that flight by departure. Families, business travelers, students heading home. Most of them would never see the two pilots sitting behind the cockpit door. They would simply hear a calm voice over the intercom welcoming them aboard, and then trust that voice to carry them safely through the sky. For Daniel Mercer, it was just another flight, another routine departure, another morning where everything looked exactly the way it should. But sometimes, the most ordinary moments are the ones that come just before everything changes. Boarding for Flight 728 moved quickly. Within 20 minutes, the cabin was nearly full. Passengers settled into their seats, placing bags in overhead compartments, while the flight attendants moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency. Inside the cockpit, Daniel Mercer and Mark Alvarez began their standard pre-flight procedures. Battery switches, navigation systems, fuel readings, hydraulic pressure. Everything was called out clearly, step by step. Fuel quantity? Mark asked. Checked. Flight controls? Free and correct. The rhythm of the checklist was almost comforting. For Daniel, it felt like music he had played thousands of times before. Outside, the early morning sun spread across the enormous runways of Denver International Airport. Ground control cleared Flight 728 to push back from the gate. The aircraft slowly reversed away as the tug vehicle guided it into the taxi lane. Then something small happened, so small that Daniel almost ignored it. A faint scent drifted through the cockpit. He paused for half a second. It was subtle, soft, floral. Mark wrinkled his nose slightly. You smell that? Daniel kept his eyes on the instrument panel. Probably cleaning spray from the cabin. But Mark shook his head. No, that's not disinfectant. He sniffed again. It smells like roses. Daniel didn't answer, because for a brief moment he had thought the same thing. But that made no sense. Cockpits don't smell like flowers. They smell like electronics, plastic, occasionally fuel, never roses. Daniel pushed the thought aside. Taxi checklist, he said calmly. Mark nodded and continued reading. Outside, the aircraft began rolling toward runway 16R, joining a long line of morning departures waiting for takeoff clearance. Everything was still normal. Everything still made sense. But as the aircraft slowly moved across the concrete taxiway, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years of flying. Not fear, not danger, just a strange, quiet feeling in the back of his mind. A feeling he could not explain. And somewhere deep in the cockpit air, the faint scent of roses lingered. Flight 728 rolled slowly into position on runway 16R. Ahead of them, the runway stretched for miles across the flat Denver plains, shimmering slightly in the morning sunlight. Mark finished the final items on the departure checklist. Flaps set. Checked, Daniel replied. Cabin secure. Checked. The aircraft ahead of them lifted into the sky, climbing smoothly toward the west. A few seconds later, the tower controller's voice came through the radio. Flight 728, line up and wait. Daniel guided the aircraft forward onto the runway centerline. The engines hummed steadily beneath them. Passengers behind the cockpit door had no idea that the moment they were waiting for, the rush of acceleration and takeoff, was only seconds away. Mark glanced at the clock. Ready when you are, Captain. Daniel placed his hand gently on the throttle levers. This was the most familiar motion in his profession. He had done it thousands of times. Push the throttles forward. The engines roar. The aircraft begins to race down the runway. But just before Daniel moved his hand, he heard it. A voice. Soft. Clear. Female. Turn back. Daniel's hand froze. The cockpit was silent except for the low hum of electronics. Mark noticed immediately. You good? Daniel slowly turned his head toward the empty space behind his seat. There was no one there. The cockpit door was locked. The jump seat was empty. No flight attendants. No passengers. Nothing. Daniel frowned slightly and turned back toward the runway. Maybe his mind had played a trick. But then the voice came again. Calm, gentle, unmistakable. Do not leave yet. Daniel Mercer had faced storms, engine warnings, and emergency landings. But in 22 years of flying, he had never heard a voice inside an empty cockpit. For a few seconds, Daniel Mercer didn't move. His hand still rested on the throttle levers. The runway lights stretched endlessly ahead. The tower radio crackled again. Flight 728, cleared for takeoff. Mark looked at Daniel. Your call, Captain. Daniel swallowed slowly. The voice still echoed in his mind. Do not leave yet. Logic fought against instinct. Pilots do not delay takeoff because of a feeling. They delay for weather, for traffic, for mechanical warnings, but not for a voice that no one else heard. Daniel looked down at the instrument panel. Every system was normal. Fuel pressure, hydraulics, engine indicators, all green. Everything said the same thing. Take off. Mark waited. Seconds passed. Behind them, 184 passengers sat unaware, trusting the two men in the cockpit to make the right decision. Daniel felt the strange calm again. The same calm that had come with the scent of roses earlier. Then he did something he had never done in his entire career. He pulled his hand away from the throttles. Tower, Daniel said into the radio. His voice was steady, but Mark could hear the hesitation behind it. Flight 728, a boarding departure. Request taxi back to the gate. Mark turned sharply toward him. What? The radio crackled with confusion. Flight 728, confirm abort? Affirmative, Daniel replied. Pause followed. Then the controller responded. Flight 728, Roger. Exit runway when able. Daniel gently steered the aircraft off the runway. Inside the cockpit, Mark stared at him. Daniel, what just happened? Daniel didn't answer, because the truth sounded impossible. He couldn't explain the voice. He couldn't explain the roses. And he definitely couldn't explain why, for the first time in 22 years of flying, he had trusted something he couldn't see. The Boeing 737 slowly exited the runway and began taxiing back toward the terminal. Inside the cockpit, the silence between Daniel and Mark felt heavier than the aircraft itself. Mark finally spoke. You aborted takeoff with no warning light, no system alert, nothing. Daniel kept his eyes forward as the aircraft rolled across the taxiway. I know. Mark stared at the instrument panel again. Everything was still perfectly normal. No engine issue, Mark said quietly. No hydraulic problem. Then he looked back at Daniel. So what made you stop the takeoff? Daniel hesitated, because the real answer would sound absurd inside a cockpit built on engineering and logic. Instead, he said the only thing he could. I had a bad feeling. Mark frowned slightly but said nothing. Pilots sometimes trusted instincts. Years of experience could create a kind of quiet awareness when something felt wrong. But even then, aborting a departure after receiving clearance from the tower was extremely rare. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, passengers had begun to notice something unusual. The aircraft had already lined up on the runway. They should have been accelerating into the sky by now. Instead, the plane was turning around. A few passengers leaned toward the windows. Others glanced at the flight attendants. One businessman in seat 14C whispered to the person beside him. Did we just go back? The flight attendants exchanged confused looks but remained calm. Ladies and gentlemen, one of them announced gently over the intercom. The captain has decided to return briefly to the gate for a quick check. No further explanation was given. Back in the cockpit, ground control guided them toward their original gate. Airport vehicles moved aside as the aircraft approached. By the time the plane came to a stop and the parking brake was set, the ground crew was already waiting. Within minutes, maintenance technicians began climbing the ladder toward the aircraft. At that moment, Daniel Mercer still wasn't sure if he had made the right decision. because every instrument inside the cockpit continued to say the same thing. Nothing was wrong. And yet, deep inside, Daniel could not shake the feeling that if they had taken off just a few minutes earlier, something terrible might already have begun. The maintenance team arrived quickly. 2 technicians climbed the ladder beside the cockpit window, while another walked beneath the aircraft, scanning the engines and landing gear with a flashlight. Inside the cockpit, Daniel and Mark removed their headsets and waited. One of the technicians stepped inside a few minutes later. "What seems to be the issue, Captain?" he asked. Daniel paused. That question was harder to answer than it should have been. "No warning lights," Daniel admitted. "No abnormal readings." The technician raised an eyebrow. "So, precaution?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, I want a full systems check." The technician didn't argue. Airline procedures allowed a captain to request maintenance inspection at any time. Still, the situation was unusual. Most delays happened because something obvious had appeared on the instrument panel. A warning message, a system fault, a sensor alert. But Flight 728 had none of those. The technician plugged a diagnostic tablet into the aircraft's maintenance port and began scanning the aircraft systems. Minutes passed. Passengers waited inside the cabin. Some scrolled through their phones. Others sighed quietly at what they assumed was just another routine airline delay. In the cockpit, the technician studied the screen. Finally, he shook his head. "Everything looks normal." Mark leaned back slightly in his seat. "Told you," he murmured under his breath. The technician continued. "No engine faults. Fuel pressure readings normal. Electrical systems stable." He unplugged the device. "You should be good to go." Daniel stared at the instrument panel again. All green. All normal. For the first time since hearing the voice on the runway, doubt crept into his mind. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe stress or fatigue had played a trick on him. Maybe the smell of roses had come from somewhere in the cabin. Maybe the voice had been nothing more than a momentary illusion. But just as Daniel began to consider restarting the departure sequence, one of the technicians beneath the aircraft suddenly called up through the radio. His voice sounded sharp.
Urgent.
"Hold on." A short pause followed. Then he said something that made everyone inside the cockpit sit up straight. "Captain, you might want to see this." Daniel and Mark stepped down from the aircraft a minute later. The cold morning air of Denver rushed around them as they followed the maintenance technician beneath the right wing. Ground vehicles hummed quietly nearby. Passengers inside the cabin still had no idea what was happening outside. The technician knelt beside an open panel near the engine housing. He pointed inside. "Look here." Daniel leaned closer. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. A maze of metal tubing, fuel lines, pressure valves. But the technician carefully moved a flashlight closer and tapped a small component with the tip of his screwdriver. "See that?" Daniel narrowed his eyes. The part was small, easy to overlook, but the metal surface showed a thin, dark stain. "Fuel residue." The technician spoke again, slower this time. "This valve controls fuel pressure to the engine feed system." Mark crouched beside them. "So?" The technician exhaled. "So this valve shouldn't look like that." He gently touched the housing again. "It's cracked." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "How serious?" The technician glanced toward the engine. "If that valve failed during climb." He didn't finish the sentence immediately. Instead, he looked at Daniel directly. "Fuel pressure could spike." Mark understood instantly. "Engine fire," he whispered. The technician nodded. "Worst case?" "Yes." For a moment, none of them spoke. Daniel looked up at the aircraft, a Boeing 737 carrying 184 passengers. If the crack had widened during takeoff, if fuel pressure had surged into the engine system, if fire had started during the early climb phase, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Daniel suddenly felt the weight of the runway decision all over again. The moment his hand had frozen on the throttle, the strange scent of roses, the voice that had spoken in the empty cockpit. "Do not leave yet." Mark finally broke the silence. How long until that valve fails completely? The technician shrugged slightly. Hard to say. Then he added quietly, but if you had taken off this morning, there's a very real chance you would have found out the hard way. Word spread quickly across the small group standing beneath the aircraft. Within minutes, another maintenance supervisor arrived to examine the cracked valve. He studied it for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. That's not a minor defect, he said. Mark crossed his arms. How bad are we talking? The supervisor straightened up. If the fuel pressure surged during takeoff or climb, the engine could have overheated or caught fire. He glanced toward the aircraft. And at that altitude, you wouldn't have much time. Daniel imagined it instantly. The aircraft lifting off. Gear retracting. The engines climbing to full power. Then suddenly, a warning alarm. Smoke. Fire in the engine housing. At that point, the crew would have been forced into an emergency situation only minutes after leaving the ground. An engine fire during climb is one of the most dangerous scenarios pilots train for. Not impossible to survive, but extremely unpredictable, especially with a full aircraft. Mark looked toward Daniel. You saved the flight. Daniel didn't answer, because that sentence felt strange. He hadn't seen the crack. He hadn't detected the fault. The aircraft's computers hadn't warned him. Nothing in the cockpit instruments had shown a problem. And yet the takeoff had been aborted anyway. Inside the aircraft cabin, passengers were now beginning to learn the reason for the delay. A quiet murmur moved through the rows of seats as a flight attendant explained that maintenance had discovered a serious issue with the aircraft. Some passengers shook their heads in relief. Others whispered quiet thanks that the problem had been caught before takeoff. Most of them would never know how close the situation might have come to disaster. They would only remember that the flight had been delayed, and that, eventually, another aircraft would take them safely to Seattle. But standing beneath the wing that morning, Daniel Mercer knew something else. The decision that had protected those 184 lives had not come from an alarm, not from a warning light, not from a checklist. It had come from something he still could not explain. After the maintenance team confirmed the aircraft would be taken out of service, Daniel slowly climbed back into the cockpit. The cabin behind him had grown quieter. Passengers were beginning to disembark so the airline could move them to another plane. But inside the cockpit, the stillness felt different now. He sat in the captain's seat and looked at the instrument panel. Everything still looked exactly the same. Green lights, normal readings, perfectly functioning systems. If not for the cracked valve beneath the engine, the aircraft would have taken off minutes earlier. Daniel leaned back slightly, and for the first time since the discovery, his mind returned to the moment on the runway. The voice, the scent of roses, the calm feeling that had washed over him when he decided to abort. He rubbed his forehead slowly. Am I really thinking about this? He murmured quietly to himself. Pilots are trained to avoid imagination in critical situations. Everything must be measurable, observable, proven. Yet Daniel could not escape the sequence of events. The voice had come before the decision, before anyone knew about the cracked valve, before maintenance inspections, before the delay. He reached down and picked up his flight bag from beside the seat. As he placed it on his lap, something small slipped out from the side pocket and landed gently on the cockpit floor. Daniel looked down. It was the laminated image his mother had given him years earlier. The small picture of the Virgin Mary. He hadn't looked at it in a long time. The edges were slightly worn. The handwriting on the back had faded a little. But the message was still there. May she watch over every mile you fly. Daniel stared at the picture longer than he expected. Then he slowly exhaled, because somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet thought had begun to form. And for the first time in 22 years of flying, Daniel Mercer wondered whether someone had been watching over that runway. The replacement aircraft for Flight 728 departed later that afternoon. Passengers eventually reached Seattle only a few hours behind schedule. For most of them, the incident quickly became just another travel story. A delayed flight, a maintenance problem, an inconvenience that ended safely. But for Daniel Mercer, the morning at Denver International Airport stayed with him long after the runway was empty again. For days, he replayed the moment in his mind. The scent of roses, the calm voice, the strange certainty that had made him pull his hand away from the throttles. He never reported the voice to the airline, not because he wanted to hide something, but because he knew how it would sound. Pilots are trained to be rational, practical, grounded in facts. A story about hearing a woman's voice in an empty cockpit would only raise questions about fatigue or stress. So Daniel said nothing. Official reports simply recorded that the captain had aborted takeoff for precautionary reasons. But something inside him had shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, just quietly. The next time Daniel prepared for a flight, he opened his flight bag as usual. Charts, manuals, headset. Then his hand paused when he saw the small laminated image again. The picture his mother had given him years ago. Daniel hesitated for a moment. Then, instead of leaving it buried in the bag, he placed it gently inside the cockpit side pocket near his seat. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't make a speech. But before closing the flight bag, he whispered something almost under his breath. "Watch over this flight." It was the first time he had ever said those words. Months later, First Officer Mark Alvarez would still think about that morning in Denver. Not because of the mechanical failure. Mechanical problems happen in aviation. Aircraft are complex machines, and maintenance teams are trained to catch issues before they become disasters. What stayed in Mark's mind was something else. The moment on the runway. He had flown with Captain Daniel Mercer several times before that day. Daniel wasn't the kind of pilot who hesitated. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't make emotional decisions. Everything Daniel did came from logic and procedure. That was exactly why other pilots trusted him. And that was exactly why the aborted takeoff felt so strange. Mark remembered the exact moment when the tower cleared them for departure. Daniel's hand had been on the throttles. Everything was ready. Then suddenly he stopped. Not gradually, not uncertainly, just stopped. Mark had asked him later that day, while they waited for the replacement aircraft. "What made you abort?" Daniel had taken a moment before answering. Then he simply said, "I felt like we shouldn't leave yet. That was all." No long explanation, no dramatic story, just a quiet sentence. Mark didn't press further. But something about Daniel's tone that day stayed with him. Because for a brief second on that runway, Mark had seen something unusual in the captain's eyes. Not fear, not confusion, something else. Calm certainty. The kind of certainty people sometimes have when they believe they have just been warned in time. Some stories in aviation are written in official reports. Engine failures, weather emergencies, technical malfunctions. Every detail recorded, analyzed, and filed away in careful documentation. But not every moment that saves lives can be explained that way. What happened on the runway at Denver that morning would appear in airline records as something simple. Departure aborted for precautionary inspection. A maintenance issue was discovered. The aircraft was repaired. Passengers continued their journey. End of report. But Daniel Mercer knew the story had begun before the maintenance inspection, before the cracked valve, before the delay. It began with a whisper inside an empty cockpit, a voice that told him to wait, a calm presence that gave him just enough certainty to stop the takeoff. And because of that one decision, 184 people returned home to their families. Parents hugged their children that evening. Spouses met each other at the airport arrivals gate. Friends continued their lives without ever realizing how close they had come to a very different ending. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder in the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, as a gentle warning, a moment of peace, a voice that appears exactly when it is needed. If this story touched your heart, write the word roses in the comments, because sometimes the smallest signs carry the greatest protection. And if you believe that heaven still watches over us in ways we cannot always see, subscribe to the Quiet Miracles and share this story with someone who might need a reminder that sometimes help arrives just in time.